All right, so we've got this stack of sources about rhetoric,
Yeah.
and we're going to focus on Aristotle's rhetoric in particular.
Yes.
And you're a philosopher, so I guess argumentation and persuasion are sort of second nature to you.
Indeed.
But Aristotle's approach to rhetoric, rooted in dialectic, it really adds like another dimension to it, doesn't it?
It does.
So in this deep dive, we're going to try to break down the rhetoric, explore those philosophical nuances, and figure out why it still resonates with us, after centuries.
That's good.
Okay, so first things first. Aristotle saw rhetoric not as, just fancy speeches, but as a counterpart to dialectic. And what's so interesting is this idea that it was a system for analyzing and using persuasive potential in like practically any situation.
Exactly. Unlike Plato, who, famously criticized rhetoric in the Gorgias, right, as like manipulation. Aristotle really wanted to legitimize it within philosophy.
Okay.
He argued that rhetoric, like dialectic, deals with matters that aren't confined to like one specific discipline.
Yeah.
They both use widely accepted premises, what we call endoxa, to construct arguments.
So it's not about rhetoric being inherently good or bad, but the purpose it serves.
Yes.
I guess you could say it's like a hammer can build a house or it can break a window.
It's a good analogy.
Right.
Now, at the heart of Aristotle's rhetoric, you have this like trifecta of persuasion ethos, pathos, and logos, right? Appealing to the speaker's character, the audience's emotions, and the logic itself.
Yeah, those famous three. It's interesting how Aristotle like dives into the nuances of each element. Like with ethos, he talks about the speaker's credibility. And it's not just about, having good sense or moral character,
Yeah.
but also projecting these qualities through speech.
Right. A speaker might not be a saint in their personal life, but
Yeah.
they can cultivate an image of, trustworthiness and competence in the eyes of the audience.
So there's a performance aspect to it,
You can say that.
almost like being on stage.
Yes. And when it comes to pathos, the appeal to emotion, things get even more interesting because Aristotle really understood how deeply emotions could influence our judgments.
Well, yeah, we've all been there. You let your emotions cloud your judgment, or maybe you're more receptive to an argument when you're in a specific mood.
Exactly. Aristotle meticulously categorized emotions: anger, fear, pity, shame, you name it.
Right.
And he analyzed how a skilled rhetorician could actually arouse or like appease those emotions in their audience to kind of guide their decisions.
It makes you think, though, doesn't it, is this manipulation, that was something that Plato was really worried about.
Right. If we look back at the Gorgias, Socrates actually compares rhetoric to cookery, right? Saying it might make things appealing, but there's no real substance to it.
Uh-huh.
But Aristotle saw it differently. He argued that using pathos ethically isn't about making the audience believe something false.
Okay.
It's about connecting with them on a deeper level, making the argument resonate with their lived experiences. So it's less about trickery and more about emphasizing that human element in persuasion.
So it's about making the audience feel the argument, not just intellectually grasp it.
Exactly. And with logos appealing to reason, that's where Aristotle's rhetoric really moves away from those manipulative tactics used by the sophists. He believed the most potent form of persuasion is actually logical argumentation, and particularly through a type of deductive reasoning he calls the enthymeme.
Enthymeme. Yeah, it's like a condensed syllogism, isn't it? Where
Yeah.
one of the premises is like implicit, allowing the audience to sort of fill in the blanks.
Precisely. One of his examples is, he is ill for he has a fever.
Right.
The unspoken premise here is all people with a fever are ill, right? And the audience familiar with this general truth, they readily accept the conclusion.
But that reliance on unstated premises, while it's efficient, couldn't it also be a bit problematic?
It could.
Because if a premise is left unsaid, doesn't that open the door to misunderstandings or even allow a speaker to sneak in assumptions that maybe the audience wouldn't agree with if they were actually stated directly?
That is a very insightful point, and it highlights that potential for manipulation with enthymemes. Aristotle, of course, believed that rhetoric should be used ethically, but you're right, recognizing this potential for manipulation is really crucial.
So enthymemes are like these shortcuts in reasoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Engaging the audience's logic, but without overwhelming them with complex chains of thought.
Yes.
But it seems like they need to be used very, very carefully.
Indeed, and Aristotle believed that enthymemes were actually most effective because they linked the argument to the audience's existing beliefs and values.
Okay.
It's not just about presenting a sound argument, it's about tailoring it to the audience and their worldview.
That makes sense.
And this is where the concept of topoi comes into play. Topoi are like argumentative schemes or patterns that are used to construct those enthymemes.
Ah, topoi. I remember them from the Copics.
Hmm.
They're like mental maps of argumentative strategies, almost helping the rhetorician navigate different subjects and adjust their arguments accordingly.
Exactly. For instance, if you're arguing about the justice or injustice of something, you might use topoi related to fairness, equality, the
Yeah.
rule of law. It's like having a toolbox filled with these different strategies, and you just pick the right tool for the job.
That's a great way to put it.
Right.
Wait, didn't Aristotle also make a distinction between common topoi and specific topoi?
Absolutely.
Something about that.
He differentiated between common topoi, which apply broadly to various topics, and then specific topoi, which are more tailored for particular genres of rhetoric.
Right, because convincing a jury in court uses different strategies than persuading a crowd at a political rally. I mean, different situations, different tools.
Precisely. And that leads us to Aristotle's three main genres of rhetoric: deliberative, judicial, and epideictic.
Deliberative for political speeches, judicial for legal arguments, and epideictic for, speeches of praise or blame.
Exactly.
And each genre has its own specific apoi, right?
Yes.
That's fascinating. It's like Aristotle really wanted to create this comprehensive system for understanding rhetoric.
He did. And let's not forget about the importance of style.
Of course, I mean, even the most brilliant argument can fall flat if it's not delivered effectively. Right? It's about grabbing the audience's attention, making them want to listen.
Exactly. And that's where Aristotle's exploration of style or lexis comes in.
Yeah.
And it's all about crafting language that is clear, engaging, and appropriate for the occasion. He argues for finding that sweet spot between clarity and dignity.
Okay.
So clarity ensures that the audience understands the message.
Yeah.
And then dignity kind of elevates the language, making it more persuasive and memorable.
So Aristotle's walking this fine line. He wants the speaker to be clear, easy to understand, but also avoid sounding simplistic or boring.
You got it.
How do you make things interesting without overdoing it? I mean, where do you even draw that line?
Well, Aristotle provides this interesting categorization of words and their effects.
Okay.
He distinguishes between curia onomata, the standard expressions, and glotta, the more unusual or metaphorical terms.
So the curie words are like the building blocks of language. Clear, straightforward, but maybe a bit dull on their own.
Exactly. That's where the glotta come in, right? They add flavor and complexity to the language.
Okay.
Think of like metaphors, similes, poetic language, all those elements that make a speech more engaging and memorable.
But too much of a good thing can backfire, right? I mean, Aristotle does caution against being overly poetic or using unnecessarily complex language, especially in prose.
He does. Moderation is key.
Right.
It's about knowing your audience and the context,
Right.
right? You wouldn't use the same language in a philosophical treatise that you would in like a casual conversation.
Right. And this brings us to Aristotle's discussion of metaphors. And it seems like he considered them more than just decorative flourishes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For Aristotle, metaphors were these powerful tools for learning and comprehension.
Okay.
They highlight similarities between things that seem completely different, revealing new insights and perspectives.
So it's not just about clever wording. It's about deepening the audience's understanding of the topic.
Precisely. Remember his example of calling old age the stubble of life.
Yeah.
It's such a striking image, right? It encapsulates that feeling of something that's lost its vitality.
It makes you think about old age differently, to recognize the similarities with something completely unrelated, like stubble.
Right. Metaphors challenge us to grasp that comparison, and this effort actually enhances our understanding and makes the message so much more memorable.
It's like solving a little mental puzzle, and the reward is a fresh perspective.
An excellent analogy. And as philosophers, I think it's especially relevant to consider how Aristotle viewed the ethical use of these metaphors.
That's a great point. How did he address that?
Well, he argued that while they are powerful, metaphors should not be used to mislead or deceive.
Okay.
They should be used to illuminate the truth, not obscure it.
Right.
He believed a good metaphor would help the audience see the subject in a new light, but not distort the subject itself.
I see. So it's about enhancing understanding without sacrificing truth or accuracy.
Exactly. And this emphasis on those ethical considerations is a consistent thread throughout the rhetoric. He was deeply concerned with how rhetoric could be misused, and he really stresses that it should be used for the benefit of society.
That actually reminds me of the question we touched on earlier about the implications of Aristotle's rhetoric for how we do philosophy today.
Yes, indeed.
How can we as philosophers use rhetoric effectively and ethically to engage with a wider audience?
It's a question worth pondering, especially today when rhetoric is often associated with just manipulation and spin.
Right.
But Aristotle's rhetoric offers a different perspective. He believed that it could be used ethically to persuade large audiences, even those without specialized knowledge.
Okay.
And this is particularly relevant for philosophers, right? Because we often grapple with complex ideas that can be difficult to communicate to a wider audience.
So it's about making those complex philosophical ideas accessible and relevant to a bigger audience, but without oversimplifying them or resorting to tricks.
Right.
It's like he's advocating for philosophical outreach,
Yeah.
encouraging us to, bridge that gap between
Yeah.
the ivory tower and the public square.
Exactly.
But how does this tie back to those different genres of rhetoric we discussed earlier?
Well, remember those three genres, deliberative, judicial, and epideictic?
Yes.
Each one offers unique opportunities for philosophers to engage with those different aspects of public life.
Okay, so let's dive into those. A bit more deliberative rhetoric deals with political speeches, right?
Yes.
It's about persuading an audience to take a particular course of action or avoid potentially harmful choices.
Precisely imagine a politician giving a speech about going to war, or a community leader advocating for a new policy. The aim there is to influence future decisions that impact the common good.
So it's about weighing the potential benefits and harms and considering those long-term consequences.
Exactly, and Aristotle provides a range of topoi specifically for deliberative rhetoric,
Hmm.
and as we mentioned before, he talks about the importance of appealing to the audience's sense of eudaimonia. Does this policy actually contribute to the well-being of the community?
So you frame the argument in terms of shared values and aspirations because people are more likely to be persuaded if they believe a decision will improve their lives.
Right. Aristotle also emphasizes understanding different forms of government
Ah.
and their implications for decision-making. A democracy might prioritize different values than an aristocracy, for example.
So it's crucial to know your audience and tailor your arguments to that specific political context.
Absolutely. Now shifting gears to judicial rhetoric, which, is all about legal arguments in the courtroom.
Okay.
And here the focus is on past events determining guilt or innocence, ensuring justice is served.
So it's about reconstructing what happened, evaluating the evidence, and presenting a case for a specific interpretation of the events.
Precisely. And Aristotle dives deep into the topoi relevant to judicial rhetoric.
Right.
He analyzes, the nature of wrongdoing, the motivations behind criminal acts, and those different degrees of culpability.
It's like a philosopher's guide to criminal law.
In a way, yes, he also explores the role of emotions in judicial rhetoric,
Uh-huh.
acknowledging that, while justice should ideally be impartial, juries are human, they can be swayed by anger, by pity, by fear.
We've all seen those courtroom dramas where a skilled lawyer appeals to the jury's emotions to win the case.
Right.
And it really makes you think about where do you draw the line between legitimate persuasion and outright manipulation.
It does. Aristotle stresses, though, that the ultimate aim of judicial rhetoric should be a just verdict,
Okay.
based on a careful consideration of the evidence and the law, not just those emotional appeals.
So it's finding that balance between logic and emotion, right? Making sure justice is served while still recognizing that human element.
Indeed. And finally, we have epideictic rhetoric, which is perhaps the most unique of the three.
Yeah.
It's not about persuading the audience to act or to judge, but rather to praise or to blame someone or something.
Like eulogies at funerals or speeches honoring national heroes.
Precisely, epideictic rhetoric kind of magnifies certain qualities, highlights virtue or vice, and shapes public perception.
So it's about using language to celebrate or condemn,
Yeah.
right? And ultimately shaping our collective memory and values.
Exactly. Aristotle examines those topoi specific to epideictic rhetoric,
Okay.
discussing concepts like honor, shame, nobility, and baseness.
Uh-huh.
And he highlights the importance of amplifying those aspects worthy of public recognition, whether it's virtues to emulate or vices to avoid.
This reminds me of the power of storytelling and how it shapes our understanding of the world.
Yes.
But even in praising or blaming, it seems Aristotle emphasizes grounding those things in truth.
Absolutely.
It's not about fabricating a persona or distorting reality.
Right. It's about using rhetoric to illuminate and amplify those qualities that deserve public recognition.
Okay.
And that ties back into this whole ethical dimension of rhetoric that we've been discussing.
It's been a fascinating journey through Aristotle's rhetoric, and his ideas really do provide a framework for understanding not just how to persuade, but how to do it ethically and effectively. And a lot of his insights seem especially relevant for us as philosophers, urging us to consider how we can make our ideas resonate with a wider audience.
I agree.
A powerful thought to conclude our deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through this exploration of Aristotle's rhetoric. It's been truly illuminating.
You're very welcome. It's like he was advocating for a kind of philosophical outreach,
Hmm.
encouraging us to engage with the public and make our ideas more accessible.
Right. He's challenging that image of
Hmm.
philosophers as,
Yeah.
detached academics. And it's like he's saying, hey, let's bridge that gap between the ivory tower and the public square. But how does this all connect back to those different genres of rhetoric we talked about?
Well, remember those three genres, deliberative, judicial, and epideictic?
Yeah.
Each one offers unique opportunities for philosophers to engage with different aspects of public life.
All right, let's break those down a bit more. So deliberative rhetoric, that's all about political speeches, right? It's about persuading an audience to take a specific action or maybe to avoid some potentially harmful choices.
Exactly. Imagine a politician giving a speech about whether or not to go to war, or a community leader advocating for a new policy.
Okay.
The goal there is to influence future decisions that will impact the common good.
So it's about weighing the potential benefits and harms, considering those long-term consequences.
Precisely. And Aristotle gives us a bunch of topoi specifically for deliberative rhetoric.
Okay.
Like we mentioned before, he talks about the importance of appealing to the audience's sense of eudaimonia.
Right.
Does this policy or action actually contribute to the well-being of the community?
So you're framing the argument in terms of shared values and aspirations because people are more likely to be swayed if they believe a decision will ultimately improve their lives.
Exactly. Aristotle also stresses the importance of understanding different forms of government. And their implications for making decisions in democracy might have different priorities than in aristocracy, for instance.
So knowing your audience and tailoring those arguments to the specific political context is crucial.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit to judicial rhetoric, which is focused on legal arguments, those courtroom settings. And here, the focus shifts to past events, figuring out guilt or innocence, and making sure justice is served.
So it's about reconstructing what happened, looking at the evidence, and presenting a case for a specific interpretation of those events.
Precisely, and Aristotle really delves into the topoi that are specific to judicial rhetoric.
Why?
He analyzes things like the nature of wrongdoing, the motivations behind criminal acts,
Okay.
and the varying degrees of culpability.
It's like a philosopher's guide to criminal law.
In a way, it is. He also explores the role of emotions in judicial rhetoric.
Okay.
Acknowledging that while justice should be impartial, juries are human and they can be influenced by things like anger, pity, or fear.
We've all seen those courtroom dramas where a lawyer tries to appeal to the jury's emotions to get the outcome they want.
Right.
And it makes you wonder, where's the line between legitimate persuasion and just plain manipulation?
It does, but Aristotle emphasizes that the ultimate goal of judicial rhetoric should always be a just verdict.
Okay.
One that's based on a careful consideration of the evidence and the law, not just those emotional appeals.
So it's about finding that balance, right? Logic and emotion, making sure justice is served, but also recognizing that human element in legal proceedings.
Exactly. And finally, we come to epideictic rhetoric, which might be the most unique of the three, because it's not about persuading the audience to take action or make a judgment, but to either praise or blame someone or something.
Think of eulogies or speeches honoring national heroes.
Precisely, epideictic rhetoric kind of magnifies certain qualities. It highlights virtue or vice, and it shapes public perception.
So it's about using language to celebrate or condemn, and ultimately shaping our collective memory and values.
Exactly. Aristotle looks at those topoi that are specific to epideictic rhetoric,
Right.
discussing concepts like honor shame, nobility, and baseness.
Okay.
And he really emphasizes amplifying those aspects that are worthy of public recognition, whether they're virtues we should try to emulate or vices we should avoid.
This makes me think about the power of storytelling and how it shapes our view of the world.
Yes.
It seems that even when we're praising or blaming Aristotle, still stresses the importance of grounding things in truth.
Absolutely.
It's not about creating a fake persona or twisting reality.
It's about using rhetoric to illuminate and amplify those qualities that deserve public recognition.
Right.
And that links back to this whole idea of the ethical dimension of rhetoric that we've been talking about.
It's like he's saying we need to do some philosophical outreach, get out there and engage with the public and make our ideas more accessible.
Right. And he believed that by tapping into shared values, crafting these compelling narratives and using metaphors that actually resonate with lived experiences, philosophers could spark some really meaningful dialogues with the public about some pretty crucial matters.
Okay.
Like, for example, he placed a lot of importance on the concept of eudaimonia,
Right.
happiness or flourishing
Okay.
as a common ground for ethical and political discourse.
That's really interesting because it really challenges that stereotype of the philosopher
Yeah.
as this detached academic, up in their ivory tower.
Right.
And he's encouraging us to bridge the gap, between that ivory tower and the public square.
Right.
But how does all this connect back to those different genres of rhetoric that we were talking about earlier?
Well, remember those three genres, deliberative, judicial, and epideictic?
Yeah.
They each offer unique opportunities for philosophers to engage with, different aspects of public life.
Right. So let's dive into those a bit more deliberative rhetoric. That's the one that deals with political speeches, right? It's about persuading an audience to take a particular course of action or to avoid making potentially harmful choices.
Exactly. Think of a politician giving a speech about going to war or a community leader trying to advocate for a new policy.
Uh-huh.
The aim there is to influence future decisions that will have an impact on the common good.
So it's about weighing those potential benefits and harms, thinking about those long-term consequences.
Precisely. And Aristotle gives us a whole bunch of topoi specifically for deliberative rhetoric. As we
Right.
mentioned before, he talks about appealing to the audience's sense of eudaimonia,
Right.
asking, does this policy actually contribute to the well-being of the community?
So framing the argument in terms of those shared values and aspirations, because people are much more likely to be persuaded if they think that a decision is going to improve their lives in some way.
Right. Aristotle also emphasizes the importance of understanding those different forms of government
Okay,
and
great.
how they might affect decision-making. A democracy might prioritize different values than an aristocracy.
So knowing your audience and tailoring your arguments to that specific political context is absolutely crucial.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to judicial rhetoric, which focuses on those legal arguments in the courtroom.
Right.
And here the focus shifts to past events, determining guilt or innocence, making sure that justice is served.
It's about piecing together what happened, evaluating the evidence and presenting a case for a specific understanding of those events.
Exactly. And Aristotle really digs deep into the topoi that are specific to this type of rhetoric, judicial rhetoric.
Okay.
He analyzes things like the nature of wrongdoing,
Okay.
the motivations behind those criminal acts,
Uh-huh.
and the different levels of responsibility involved.
So it's like a philosopher's guide to criminal law.
In a way, yeah. He also explores the role of emotions in judicial rhetoric,
Okay.
recognizing that even though justice should ideally be impartial, juries are made up of people, and those people can be swayed by things like anger, pity, or even fear.
Yeah. And we've all seen those courtroom dramas where a lawyer is really playing on the jury's emotions to try and get the result they want.
Right. It makes you wonder, where do you draw that line between legitimate persuasion and just, flat out manipulation?
It does, and Aristotle emphasizes that the ultimate goal of judicial rhetoric should be a just verdict,
Yes.
one that's based on carefully considering the evidence and the law, not just on those emotional appeals.
Exactly. And finally, we have epideictic rhetoric, which is maybe the most unique of the three,
Right.
because it's not about convincing someone to do something or make a judgment, but rather to praise or to blame someone or something.
So things like eulogies or speeches given to honor national heroes.
Exactly. Epideictic rhetoric is all about amplifying certain qualities, highlighting virtue or vice, and shaping how the public perceives things.
So it's about using language to celebrate or to condemn and ultimately influencing our collective memory and our values.
Precisely. And Aristotle looks at the topoi that are specific to this epideictic rhetoric, discussing concepts like honor and shame, nobility and baseness.
Right.
And he really highlights the importance of amplifying those aspects that are worthy of public recognition, whether it's virtues to try to emulate or vices that we should try to avoid.
This reminds me of the power of storytelling and how those stories really shape our understanding of the world.
Yes, and even when it comes to praising or blaming, Aristotle still emphasizes grounding those things in truth.
Uh-huh.
It's not about making up a persona or distorting reality. It's
Right.
about using rhetoric to illuminate and amplify those qualities that truly deserve to be recognized.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey through Aristotle's rhetoric, and his ideas really do offer a framework for understanding not just how to be persuasive, but how to do it ethically and effectively. And it seems like a lot of his insights are particularly relevant for us, as philosophers, urging us to consider how we can connect with a wider audience.
I agree. As you continue to explore the world of rhetoric, Remember, Aristotle's insights pay attention to how language is used to persuade, to move, to inspire. And most importantly, always consider the ethical implications of your words and the power that they hold.
A powerful thought to end our deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through this exploration of Aristotle's rhetoric. It's been truly enlightening.